Hey guys, hope you're doing well. Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther is a man who lived many years ago, 600 years ago, but he changed the world. And I just wanted to read, there's a good section here I wanted to read to you. I'm sharing this on Martin Luther King Day, if you will, that during that season, because of the name. But I want you to know where Martin Luther King got his name from and what that has to do with, right? So I'm making this video actually in May of 2020 because that's when I'm reading it. So I'll put this up on YouTube, but I'm going to reshare this again, probably every Martin Luther King Jr. Day going forward. I'm going to set up a reminder to reshare this video. Let me just read this. Just listen in. I might make some commentary along the way. In the early 16th century, that's the 1500s for those of you who don't really care about that stuff, but we're curious. Martin Luther struggled to comprehend the righteousness of God, and his struggle led to the Protestant Reformation and the rediscovery of the truth of justification by faith alone. So what does that mean? It means he was a Catholic. Roman Catholic Church took over about 300, 400 AD. Pretty much was the only Christian faith in the world, and it had a lot to do with works and not justification by faith. Before that, the disciples knew it was all about faith in Jesus, and their works were an outpouring of their faith, not a requirement for salvation. So anyway, so he rediscovers that. When Luther heard the phrase, quote, the righteousness of God, unquote, he cowered in fear before a threatening deity. An Augustinian monk, Luther felt he was in bondage to an exacting God who could never be pleased. That's the performance reward system of the world, being poured out on human beings, right? We have to do the right things to please the right person. That's what he thought. To Luther, God was a terror. His religious devotion was prompted by a need to please God's anger, or to satisfy God's anger. It was out of fear that he gave up a potentially lucrative career in law to enter the monastery. The turning point came on a hot July afternoon in the year 1505. As he approached the Saxon village of Stotterheim, the skies grew more and more menacing. Suddenly there was a crashing storm, punctuated by a bolt of lightning that knocked him to the ground. Wow. Fearing for his life and convinced this was a message from God, coincidence, right? We all say that. Luther cried out in terror, "Saint Anne, help me and I will become a monk." For Luther, God was to be feared and pleased or placated. This terror culminated when he had to serve his first communion. He thought of taking his hands and holding the very body and blood of Christ was too much. When he came to the prayer of consecration, he froze at the altar, his eyes glazing over and beads of sweat forming on his forehead. A nervous hush filled the congregation. Luther could not even speak. He had to stop, and he took his seat in disgrace. I'm going to continue reading. Just want to point out that those of you who are of the Catholic faith, you recognize this. You recognize what the communion means to those in the Catholic faith and what the prayer of consecration means. Those who are maybe never brought up in those circles. I'm Sicilian. I was brought up in those circles. It ran through my blood for many years. It doesn't now, but we'll talk about that some other time. Those who've never experienced that, the Catholic Church believes that when you take communion, it's the actual body and blood of Jesus, right? That we're doing that not just in remembrance, but he is saying, this is my body, this is my blood to the disciples, and he's saying that to us. No comment on that. We'll maybe cover that some other time, but just for context, I wanted to share that. When Luther came to the prayer of consecration for the communion elements, he was supposed to say, "We offer unto you, God, the living, the true, the eternal God." Luther wrote about this moment in reflection, and here's what he said. "At these words, I was utterly stupefied and terror-stricken. I thought to myself, who am I? Who am I that I should lift up my eyes or raise my hands to a divine majesty? Shall I, a little pygmy, say, I want this, I ask for that? For I am dust and ashes and full of sin, and I am speaking to the living, eternal, and the true God." I mean, that's powerful. I can make comments about what that means, but I'll just suffice to say that any mistake we make is impurity. God and his kingdom are 100% pure, and if we try to enter his presence and we have any impurity, we destroy the purity of that place that he is in, and that's why we can't approach him if we're not pure. I made a whole nother video about that. I think it's called the performance reward system versus Christianity or something like that. Anyway, let me continue. Yet Paul's positive use of the phrase, this is Paul. Paul is a former Jewish leader. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, teaching other Pharisees, so convinced of his ways that he was out trying to get Christians arrested and killed because he disagreed with their perspective. Then he experiences Jesus and he's like, oh man, now I see the truth. I know what you're talking about. And so many of us have experienced that. But here's what he says. Yet Paul's positive use of the phrase, quote, the righteousness of God, in Romans, by the way, chapter 3, they're talking about, intrigued Luther. Paul was saying that this was a good thing rather than something harmful. Luther came to realize that his view of God was only half correct. One version of the Bible is the best translation of Paul's point, and it says, so that he would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. The righteousness of God is twofold. God is just, pure, 100%. We can't come close to him. But he's also the justifier. Luther was right to say that God is just. The justice of God is an expression of his holiness, which is in total opposition to our sin, regardless of how small. Even a mispronunciation of a word is a mistake. God doesn't make mistakes. If I enter his presence with anything like that on my record, I destroy the purity and perfection of the kingdom, the atmosphere around him. I won't be allowed in, right? So, there is a genuine hostility that God feels when we flagrantly violate his will. To violate God's holy standard is to incur a penalty that must be paid. Justice must be satisfied with judgment. This Luther understood all too well. And we should too. When we read about Adam and Eve all the way back in the beginning, they lived in that atmosphere with God. And God said, hey, listen, I have knowledge of good and evil. You have free will, but you don't have the strength to do what's right all the time, every time. You're not a God. You are a creation. He says, so if you eat that fruit, which might be a metaphor of knowledge or something, but he says, if you eat that fruit, you're going to know the difference between good and evil, and then you're going to be held accountable for what you do wrong. You're going to be held accountable for shame, for lying, for anything like that. So Eve lies. My voice is changing. I must be a teenager. Eve lies about God before she eats the fruit. She didn't have knowledge of good and evil yet. And the enemy comes to her and says, hey, did God say don't eat that fruit? And she goes, oh yeah, no, God said don't eat that fruit. He even said don't touch that fruit. We can't touch it. We can't eat it. We are not supposed to go anywhere near that fruit. God only said don't eat it. They were actually supposed to tend the garden. So when we think of that, we think of pruning trees, cleaning up maybe leaves that fall as the trees go through the natural life cycle. They were allowed to go near it. They were probably allowed to touch it. But Eve said something that God never, at least it's not recorded in our Bible, he never said. But she's not held accountable because she doesn't know the difference between good and evil yet. Just like you and I have made a lot of mistakes, but the moment we realize what we're doing wrong, we're supposed to, with our conscience, stop. That's how it works. So yeah, there's punishment for some things that we do wrong. If I accidentally, take somebody's life, it's called manslaughter. There's a punishment for that, but it's different than murder. Well, in God's eyes, the little things that happened back then, the knowledge of good and evil made Adam and Eve wrong. And he says, if you have wrong in you, your soul will die. You're going to die. You can't continue with me. Right? Because I need purity, I need perfection here. So when Luther understood this concept, he knows that God's going to sit there and he's going to go, man, I've got to judge this. It's a love thing to keep the kingdom, to keep the atmosphere around him pure for everyone who's still there. And those who have chosen the path of imperfection, they're not there anymore. So Luther understands this. So let's continue. But that's not the whole story. As Luther came to realize, God is just, but he also justifies. he not only exacts demands, there I go again, he not only exacts demands, but shows mercy as well. Justification is a legal term, but it does not mean that we are not guilty or declared innocent before God. Justification is the full recognition that the crime has been committed and there must be a payment for it. So on one hand, God's verdict is guilty as charged. And on the other hand, it says you're free. Payment for the crime has been made. Justification means that all the demands of the law have been met, equally balanced in the phrase righteousness of God are justice and mercy. But how can we be guilty yet also be free to go? How can God remain just and also release us from the payment of our sin, of our imperfection? I want to strongly suggest that you go check out my other YouTube video. I believe it's called, again, Performance, Reward versus Christianity, or something close to that. It was also recorded today, May 24th, 2020, so maybe you can find it as that on my channel. God bless you guys. Go with God. Get close to Him. You know something? Our perfection by grace through Jesus Christ is covered, is paid for. We can enter that atmosphere with God now and in eternity. And I want to invite you there. So come check it out. God bless.